disclaimer. Let me first put a disclaimer and just say that I'm not a fan of the United Nations. But it is what we have right now, where all nations are represented. So we have to force to make it work. But while we do that, let's not fool ourselves. We need to remember that the ground on which it stands in New York was given by a transnational corporation called Rockefeller. So we shouldn't fool ourselves and think it's going to be an easy battle. Maybe that's why it's taken 10 years just to draft a treaty. So we need to keep pushing. So this room gives me hope. We need to push. How do I do this in terms of illicit financial flows? You know, the first time I heard how much we lose as a continent, it was just mind-boggling. Remember, this has been happening since colonization. I mean, transnational corporations, I know they don't pay tax anyway, but I mean, the human rights violations are worse in Africa because of weak state capacity. The first time it was quantified was only 30 years, and colonization started when? We're talking a century, but they could only study 30 years. And in 30 years, the figure they came up with for Sub-Sahara alone was $1.4 trillion. That's I can't even imagine it in my head. And I think the bulk of that money is what is shocking, because 65% of it is corporate crimes. Only 5% is African government, direct African government corruption, and 30% is criminal. But they are very clever. They have coined something. They are making a juxtaposition. They say there's tax avoidance and there's tax evasion. And they say, no, tax avoidance is illegal. But tax evasion in South Africa, Maxine will know. Tax evasion is okay. It just means you have a clever Indian lawyer who's helping you how to cook your books, you know. And I'm thinking, but the effects are the same. The effects is base erosion, capital flight. That's money that's supposed to be staying in Africa to build Africa up. So for us, from a moral perspective, both tax evasion and tax avoidance are immoral, and they should both be illegal. But to give you a direct example, it is said that to bring the whole continent to speed in terms of infrastructure development, can we make Africa, I hate the categories, but that's the nearest thing to make an example with. You know, there's first world, second world, third world, I don't even know what that means, but let's play with it. To bring African infrastructure up to the so-called first world, we need around 130 to 170 billion. But do you know how much we lose as a continent annually in illicit financial flows? Firstly, they say, the money is there, but we have a shortfall of 103 billion. But do you know how much we lose annually as a continent? 95 billion, that's annual, US dollars. So do we really have a shortfall to bring our infrastructure development up to speed? We don't. So for me, illicit financial flows truly is another form of colonization. And remember, for Africans, it doesn't stop there. It's not that they don't pay tax. It's also that they underpay the workforce in Africa. Somebody again, and by the way, we have to put the word racism in this category. That's why we are calling for the restructuring or the transformation of the international, global, financial and political architecture. So you can't remove racism. But someone again came with this clever thing that, there is first world wages, second world wages, and third world wages. Now, lone men in South Africa, where 34 miners were shot in cold blood, most of them at the banks were fighting for 12,500. Rock drill operators, lone men ran the same outfit in Australia, and we checked what they pay them would qualify for a middle management salary in South Africa. Now, they don't just not pay tax, they underpay the workers. Now, there's a third thing also involved. They don't close mines, they don't reconcile mines. If you go now to Google and you say map of Johannesburg and you say open mines, it looks like a minefield actually. They don't reconcile mines, they respect no standards. Dada talked about it yesterday. There is something called free, prior and informed consent for any mining company to come and have an operation. 90% of the time when they tell our governments they are prospecting, they are already mining. And there is no free, prior and informed consent, because they get people in the room, pay whoever they pay, and they get away with it. So really, in the actual sense of the word in Africa, excuse the language, but that's what English says, money talks and bullshit walks all the time. There are 54 countries now. I sat in that room just now and I felt very angry with Maxine that she dragged me to come and listen to this. 54 African countries, only 6 were present. 6. And then also, what are they talking about? Who asked these countries to come here and report about what each one is doing to hold corporates accountable? That's not what they were appointed for. This is an intergovernmental working group to draft an instrument, to draft a treaty that should be ratified. They are not talking about that. They are talking about what they are each doing individually. And I don't know for Europeans, but for Africans, I can already answer you why there were only 6 countries, and even the submission they gave was so meek, you know. It's because when they go and they do that to African countries, evade tax, that's why we call it base erosion, capital flight, they're impoverishing the state itself. So the African state is currently collecting more money from pay-as-you-earn than it is collecting from corporate tax. That's why we say taxing the poor. And as if that's not enough, they then go for these frivolous taxes because it's not enough, because we are also a continent of high unemployment. So that pay-as-you-earn, you should know, the bulk of the workforce is even at the lower categories, it's peanuts. So now they go for frivolous taxation, we call them regressive, your VAT, your fuel levy, and all that. So the burden is on poor people. Now, if the burden is on poor people and we're not raising enough money, it means who funds the AU? The EU. You know, the EU Parliament funds the AU. So do you think the AU, their seat was empty here? Do you think the AU is going to come here and fight corporations and risk not their salaries not being paid because the EU withdrew its budget? So you see, this is very intersectional. It's a vicious cycle. And then you have a country like Zambia that did not show up. Zambia is currently spending 95% of a ratio to GDP to service debt. Are you aware? But they are not here to fight for this. But how can they be here to fight for this? Because when they defaulted on debt and the Kwacha was restructured, I'm sure they had to take loans, and those loans have conditions. And half the time we don't know what the conditions are. You can see by the action of that state that, oh, the conditions said this. It's madness. You take a country like Malawi. Malawi in 2022 was asked to devalue the kwacha by 25%. Imagine if the euro was devalued by 25%. Life would come to a standstill. I mean, Europe will be screaming. But Zambia was in 2022, and as if that was not enough, the following year, 2023, they were asked to devalue by 44%. People queue for salt, for milk. They did that 9 months into an election. You cannot do that to any country in Europe. So international racism, these rating agencies are also part of it, because they threaten African governments with devaluing currencies. I have often wondered, I think, and which is why yesterday I told the joke, there is no Swiss chocolate because these coffee beans come from Ghana. There is no British gold, it's South African and it's Ghanaian. But the power of a single narrative, which is another thing they use, you know, in the 20th century, there was very little protest in Europe because at least capitalism was still afloat, you know. And then they managed to convince the workforce in Europe, we are better than the African workforce. No, you're not. Rudy is gone. Rudy told you, no, you're not, because capitalism does this. So now in the 21st century, we are seeing Europeans wake up and say, my God, capitalism is a heavy system. We've been telling you that since it was invented. That's what we've been telling you. And you guys were telling us, no, work harder. Your governments are the ones who are stealing. You know, fix corruption, you'll be where we are. No, you are where you are because of what you were still benefiting. The rest of what Europe was still gleaning in terms of wealth was still the slavery and colonialism wealth, which is waning currently. So now we are looking at capitalism in stark reality and we are seeing it for what it is. And I think which is why for me this room gives me hope, because it says the global south and the global north, the workers, the CSOs, the grassroots organizations, we are the ones who need to fight and push for the ratification of this treaty, because if we do not do that, left up to states, it shall not happen. I mean, South Africa, last year, I wasn't even in parliament. They forced a resolution to shut down the Israeli embassy. You've already taken them to court. So why you still have their embassy? You've taken them to court and branded them a criminal state.
So why do you still have their embassy? The next best thing to do in terms of international relations is to reduce the mission or shut it down. They will not go that far because they also speak with a forked tongue. You understand? So the issues in Africa truly for me are intersectional, and corporate impunity in Africa, I think it's unthinkable. I think which is why for us, when we formed Uplift, we were just like, we need to make sure every parliamentarian consciously knows what IFFs are, and they start fighting in their parliaments. And depending on, because in some of these countries also even human rights are violated, so depending on permissible language, even if you can't do something in terms of the law, but at least make it a table conversation, drag it to the National Assembly, talk about it so the nation knows there's something called illicit financial flows. And I think we've gotten there now, and in the next decade, which is why I left it, they need to now take it to a qualitative, but I'm branching off to the gender because it's another animal we have not talked about. As an African woman, I just feel the weight of the white woman, the Asian woman on my shoulders. I cannot wait for the day I can hear you guys all fall off, so I can just be me, truly. Because racism, we can all have the same struggles here and talk about corporate impunity. For the white woman, the race still speaks for you. There's a woman in South Africa called Khanyisile, and you know, clever blacks, that's what we call them in South Africa. When she speaks about white privilege and how it works, they think they're being clever. They say, oh, if you are so committed to the black cause, give everything you have to black people. And she says, it's like you didn't listen to everything I said. I can give it out tomorrow. It will take me 5 years to leave you where you are and raise still far above you, because the privilege speaks for me. So for me also, while we talk of corporate impunity, please, we should not leave the issue of race and of gender, because that's how it's playing out in Africa. It is the African woman that bears the burden the most, and it would, for me, really be inconsiderate to sit here and not bring them into the room. Thank you.